So welcome back again to the Molonglo Theatre here in the J.G. Crawford building. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon session. My name is Bronwyn Parry. I am a Professor and Dean of the College of Arts and Social Sciences here at the ANU. So it's nice for me to get out. They let me out on occasion to the other side of the campus. So I'm delighted to be here. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome you all to this event, which of course is hosted by the Migration Hub. I think Alan's work with the Migration Hub out of Regnet is truly impressive. I'm always impressed by how many really interesting scholars and also external stakeholders Alan is able to bring together for these very important discussions on migration. So I thank him for all of his service in that regard. So this afternoon we have a particularly interesting session and panel which is on the latest on immigration outcomes. Now, this session will last an hour, so we have 30 minutes with 10 minutes from each of our esteemed invited guests, and then we have 30 minutes for you as the audience to ask any questions that you may have. And there's quite a lot of you here this afternoon, which is terrific. So I would ask that when you ask your questions, you put your hand up so that we can find you. We'll deliver you a mic. If you can keep your question or comment relatively succinct, then that will give us time to get through quite a few, I hope, in the 30 minutes. Okay, so that's terrific. So I would like to first introduce our first guest, Sneha Chatterjee, who is the first Assistant Secretary of the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And I would like to welcome Sneha this afternoon and ask her if she'd like to come to the podium and give us her address. If you'd like to make a welcome. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah. I do not have a presentation. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bronwyn. I feel as an alumni of the Crawford School, I feel like I've self-actualized as a former master's student. But thank you very much for having me, and it's great to be part of the panel. I guess a bit different to some of the presentations and really interesting discussions this kind of throughout today. I wanted to talk to you about the Office for Multicultural Affairs, some of our priorities and what we're doing, and how the work we do is inextricably linked to the conversation about migration. I would like to start by saying Australia is the most successful multicultural nation in the world. It's good to get this out of the way early. Now we can move on. Like Minister Hill said earlier, lots of big milestones in 2025, 80 years since the establishment of the immigration function, although Mark Cully was just telling me it was much, much earlier, our kind of migration history. The anniversary of the Racial Discrimination Act, and of course the establishment or re-establishment of the Office for Multicultural Affairs. Fundamentally, migration has transformed Australia into one of our most successful multicultural societies. But it's combined with that conversation about our democratic values, economic opportunity, and a shared commitment. So, like Minister Hill said, multiculturalism is a fact. It's who we are. It's my story. It's probably lots of your stories as well, and lots of familiar faces around the room who I know are very, very much ascribed to that kind of part of our conversation. We were established only 4 months ago, and I think it's important to say it was only 4 months ago because I know that lots of you in the room work very closely with different parts of our function, but in our new organisational arrangements, YOMA was established 4 months ago, and what that means is that we report to the very first standalone Cabinet Minister for Multicultural Affairs in Minister Dr. Anne Ali. We have responsibility for programs, policies and engagement that touch every part of the community, and we have staff right around the country. We have responsibility for our refugee settlement programs. We have responsibility for our adult migrant English program, our translating and interpreting service, community grants, policies and engagements, and everything in between. But like I was saying earlier, that conversation about multiculturalism and migration, it's so linked. And often, as you find in the public debate, it can become a really difficult conversation to have. But we like to refer to the Scanlon report around the mapping social cohesion kind of review that they did. And fundamentally, 83% of the respondents said that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. And 78% of respondents agree that immigrants improve Australian society. So I can put my hand up and give that a big tick. And 80% say that they're good for the economy. However, despite high support for multiculturalism, discrimination and prejudice remains. So 16% of respondents say they've been discriminated against based on their skin colour, their religion and their ethnic origin. And it is part of that piece of research around discrimination that is a key part of the priorities of the Office for Multicultural Affairs. Part of our role is promoting a vision for Australia where all people, regardless of their cultural and linguistic background, have the opportunity to fully contribute meaningfully and belong to the Australian community. It's a lot to unpack with belonging, but Bronwyn told me I only have 10 minutes, so I won't unpack that fully. But there's some key bits of that. Multiculturalism is a key asset to who we are as Australia. When we say that we're an incredibly successful society, it is actually a reflection of generations of migration. And we're not about being a marginal portfolio, about multiculturalism being the other, you know, that if you're not multicultural, then you're, like, if you are multicultural, you're something other. But we are kind of part of the Australian story. Minister Ali has challenged us to reimagine multiculturalism. And I always think about this in the context of my own story, migrating to Australia in 1991. Victoria in 1991 was a really different place to what it is now. I live in Sydney, but Melbourne, I can tell you, there was one place you could buy Indian groceries in Victoria at that time. I think it's still there. It's a wholesaler now. But I remember my dad looking up Chatterjee in the phone book, in the white pages as it was, to find another Chatterjee, and there was one other family and we became friends with them. We don't have phone books anymore, and there's probably heaps of Chatterjees in Victoria, judging by the numbers of Indian migrants to Victoria. But it's amazing that I get to stand here with you today and talk about multiculturalism and kind of reflect on a modern Australia where people come from many different places and bring with them their stories and kind of have the opportunity to fully embrace what we get to do here in this great country. We're looking at 4 key principles about a reimagined multiculturalism. The first one is about acknowledging First Nations people. We have 65,000 years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history in Australia. Their stories are fundamentally part of the Australian story. And so it's not looking at multiculturalism in terms of First Nations history, colonial history, and then multicultural, whatever that is. It is reflecting on thousands and thousands of years of that Australian story. The second bit is about equality of participation. So it's not about shared cultural values, but about participation in political, social and economic life. We have the most culturally diverse parliament that we've ever seen, but that is not necessarily replicated in all decision-making bodies around Australia, in both corporate and right across civil society. The other bit is around breaking down structural barriers, active efforts to dismantle structural barriers to participation, leadership programs, underutilisation of migrant skills and qualifications, economic participation, if you will, and underrepresentation in leadership roles. And it's also it's important that we don't shy away from acknowledging and tackling racism, discrimination and exclusion, because that is also part of that conversation. Finally, it's about recognising multiculturalism as core to our national identity, and to my kind of earlier comments around that, it's mainstream, it's not the other. So, like I said earlier, the Office for Multicultural Affairs brought together a whole range of key functions. Some of those include our community liaison network and our network of engagement officers around Australia who engage with grassroots communities. AMEP, who I'm sure lots of you are familiar with, Settlement Services, TIS, our translating and interpreting service, providing language services to some of the most vulnerable people in the community. We also deliver a pretty big grants program for those playing along at home, both in terms of commitments from the election, but also other programs to support grassroots communities. So capacity building programs for communities, opportunities for people to come together, share their cultural stories and celebrations, but also to encourage cross-cultural programs. So lots of grants associated with that. And of course, our settlement programs, including CRISP, including the HSP and SETS. We have, like I said, lots of different priorities, but a key thing is about reflecting that multiculturalism is not about new arrivals. It's second, third, fourth generation Australians, and it's something that Minister Ali will often reflect on, that the migrant experience is not the same for everybody, even those from New Zealand. But the breadth of the work that we do is vast, and some of the key principles that I wanted to kind of reflect on, and that we're really keen to continue to work with you, although I think a good chunk of you also work with us, is around forging close links with communities and with academics to understand the research. You know, it has to be more than just the vibe of the thing. I think, Alan, we talked about. It has to be evidence-based and not policy that is evidence-led either. Working closely with our states and territories. So it's not just the Commonwealth working solely with states and territories. And I saw there were some VPS representatives earlier as well, but working in collaboration, deconflicting to actually have the most impact for community. Working with other Commonwealth agencies, just because a program or a policy is about supporting culturally diverse communities does not mean that it's our responsibility, but there is a requirement to really make sure that policies and programs support the whole community, which is fundamentally diverse. And capacity building. So they're kind of our key, I'd say they're key principles. And I will always say to my team, well, have we spoken to our stakeholders? Do we know what impact that policy or that program is going to have? What are people telling our community liaison officers? How does that resonate? And what is the experience of those people? We're working really closely with Jenny, who's the AEBS representative, but also other organisations who do research, including the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, SBS, and of course Scanlon as well. We're waiting for the imminent release of the Scanlon Foundation's Multiculturalism in Focus report, which we anticipate coming out in the next couple of weeks. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of some of those pieces of research to help inform the next stages of our policy as we continue to support Minister Ali with that work. Anyway, Bronwyn, you've given me the signal. Thank you. Thank you. I'm well trained. So I'll leave it there, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the OMA, and very happy to participate in questions further on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Snehal. Great to hear about all of that work, and as a great supporter of multiculturalism myself, and someone who I hope is working towards enabling a more multicultural society, it was a great pleasure for me to be the sponsor for the Australian Refugee Welcome University scheme here at the ANU, which is just about to bring its first students from Southeast Asia who are displaced Muslim refugees to come to this university and take up their positions to study here over the next few years. So I'm delighted to be able to promote that scheme to you. Okay, it now falls to me to introduce Emeritus Professor Peter McDonald, who is one of the most eminent demographers that we have in Australia. And Peter has a very long and deep understanding of migration policy and migration practice in this country. And I'm delighted to welcome him to the podium to give us his address.
Yeah. Okay, it's all in the title. Are temporary workers guest workers? How do we get it to move? Yeah, okay. So, not a guest worker country, Australia. Here's a couple of statements saying that. The fundamental premise of Australian immigration policy until the 1990s was that we admitted to Australia, people admitted became permanent residents, enjoyed the same rights and privileges as everybody else. Marcus Jupp and McDonald. But also Peter Costello. Australia has never been a guest worker country. We've never been a country where we bring you in and ship you out. I don't think Australia will be a guest worker country, and I don't think Australians want to see that. And that was about Costello rules out importing islanders. Today, 32,000 seasonal workers. This is the permanent residents on shore. One of the reasons that temporary migrants contribute to is that they are most of the permanent resident. Most of the new permanent people are taken from temporary residents already on shore. We hear of a program, 185,000, sorry, as the permanent program. A lot of people out there think that's 185,000 new skilled migrants coming to Australia. In fact, the number that came in 2024 was 16,000 out of that 190,000 from overseas. The vast majority are either family members or they're already living here in Australia. This is the growth of the temporary population. This is the population present in Australia. Some of those are actually not in the estimated resident population, but not very many. And you see a nice trend there. So it's almost a linear trend with when you take that blue line into account through the pandemic, and increasing from 800,000 to 1.8. So a million increase in the temporary population in this pretty short period. And now I'm using net overseas migration numbers, and you can see how the temporary one, the orange one, is way above the permanent one, and how they get further and further apart. Now, I was one who subscribed to the two of them in the long term being rather similar up till about 2012, but they have since, and they were up till that time, but since then they've diverged quite substantially. And non-departures of temporary visas on people on temporary visas have been flat, and they were very flat in recent times because of people newly on temporary visas, but starting to tick up, and we're hoping to see that tick up be a bit stronger in the future. So what groups are responsible? New Zealanders are not included in this, so I don't see them as temporary migrants because they can stay here forever. So temporary students, temporary skilled, temporary working holidays, temporary visa, temporary visitor. So the way the ABS counts NOM, you can come in as a visitor on a temporary visa, a tourist, but then you convert on shore and you stay long term. Most of the people in the past that did that were students, but in more recent times, the government has restricted that, and that's how you see this drop here from quite a substantial drop. It's mainly because the government has restricted people coming in on temporary visas and switching over to a student visa. So the student visas have gone up by the look of it, but not when you consider this. The ones that are going up in a big way at the moment are the temporary skilled and the temporary working holiday makers. So that's the scene. Now I'm going to talk a bit about temporary workers. This is from the 2021 census, the percentage of each of those groups that are employed at the census and the percentage who are employed in skilled jobs. And the main skilled jobs that they're in, I've got listed at afterwards. So for example, working holiday makers, a lot of them are working as farm managers, not just picking broccoli or whatever. And a lot are working in construction and in IT as props up across all the categories. When you can take those percentages there, multiply them together, and you get the percentage of the total who are in skilled jobs. If I apply those numbers to today's population in each of these categories, you end up with almost 500,000 skilled temporary migrants working in skilled jobs today. Almost 500,000. And that's 7% of all skilled workers. And most tellingly perhaps, between 2021 and 2024, temporary migrants provided more new skills to the economy than did permanent skilled migrants. And if you add New Zealanders to that as well, it becomes even bigger. Just a bit about ageing. The percent of aged 65 and over among temporary residents, 2.6%. Among a group Australian born, with both parents born in Australia, 18%. So temporary migrants make a huge difference to the age distribution of the population. With some interviews that I've done, I've found that 40 to 70% of workers in residential aged care centres are temporary migrants. So the aged care residence sector is dependent on temporary migrants. And there's a lot of other stories of that nature across the economy. Pipeline, the Minister talked about the pipelines earlier on and the problems, and they are a big problem. So delays in issuing permanent migration visas contribute to the growth of the temporary population. And Section 87 of the Migration Act states that visa grants to partners and children of Australian citizens cannot be capped, but they are very tightly controlled at annual planning levels, meaning that they are actually capped. So Australian governments for the last 15, 20 years have been breaking the law in not providing permanent residence to partners and children of Australian citizens, and rather delaying. They eventually do, but it's the delay that's important. And so there's currently a pipeline of about 1,000 partners and children of Australian citizens waiting for permanent residence. That's a big, big number. But the grants are around about 40,000 a year. So do your mathematics, that's 2.5 years waiting time on average. But it's blowing out on the present trend. Within 4 years' time, by 2029, that pipeline is going to be 200,000, and the wait time will be 5 years, which is completely intolerable. Just think if it was your partner. Applications for temporary skilled visas are also growing out, big pipeline. It's the major pathway, but only 20. So moving from employer-sponsored moving to employer-sponsored permanent residence from the temporary skills scheme, only 25,000 grants in that year, but there's been 86,000 applications in the last year. They're way, way apart. So we're heading for a crunch. We're creating a hybrid, what we call a hybrid guest worker situation. Hybrid because very few of them remain after 10 years. But the sectors of the economy are very, very dependent on temporary migrants. And increasing delays. There is a big crunch coming. There is definitely a big crunch coming. But meanwhile, the politicians are off jousting at the mass migration windmill. That's what's keeping them busy rather than what is important, this coming crunch. And finally, we hear a lot about wage exploitation and sexual exploitation of temporary migrants. These occur, and they're pretty shocking when they do. but they're minor compared with the exploitation by the government of Australia and the people. That's you and me. The carrot of potential permanent residence enables government exploitation. They pay very large fees and charges. They pay the same taxes as everyone else, but they do not receive the benefits that the standard taxpayer receives: Medicare, free education for children, etc. And so our temporary workers are guest workers, and they are exploited just like guest workers in any other country.
Okay, thanks everybody. That is great. That was a really interesting talk in a very short period of time, I thought. So I'd now like to introduce Jenny Doback to you. She is the Director of Migration Statistics at the ABS, and Jenny has a very long and rich history of being across the statistical material that we need to really understand migration trends around the world. So I welcome Jenny and her expertise to the stage.
Thank you for having me here. I feel quite honoured to be in such esteemed company and be on, oh yes, thank you. Be on the panel with Peter and Sanaya. And I feel like very much I'm with old friends. I've seen there's a lot of people in this audience that I've connected with over the years and worked with and supported. So I feel like, yeah, it's wonderful to be here with you today and starting to talk about some of our latest achievements. So my role, so I'm Jenny Doback. My role is Director of Overseas Migration and Migrant Statistics. And so I look after a team that produces migrant relevant outcomes data, working out of the Adelaide office. I know they're watching today, to shout out to you and your hard work. And also a team that produces migration statistics, net overseas migration, that feeds into the population estimates that we've also talked about today. So two teams, but today I am going to be talking about the work of the National Migrant Statistics Unit. So that unit is a small unit, and we've been in operation since 2006. And our key role is statistical leadership in looking after statistical infrastructure, custodians of standards and classifications, to be experts in the field of migration statistics across the ABS, but also to thoroughly understand our policy environment. So way back in 2006, Mark Cully, I see in the audience, very much part of that story. We started data linking, backlinking migration data to the census, and that's where the story began for us. With understanding the benefits and the huge benefits from linking and using administrative data. So I know the team in Adelaide have been wanting me to say this. We came before PLIDA, our work linking migration data to census and producing the Australian Census Migrants Integrated Data Set. And also a bit later, and Peter, I know, uses this data set fair bit, the Australian Census Temporary Entrance Integrated Data Set, linking temporary visa holders' information to census. So we've continued to innovate since then and built on our data integration initiatives. We do this, I must give a plug to our we still have a very rich relationship with our friends at the Department of Home Affairs. Justin, you talked about the migrant linked outcomes. We've been really excited to be part of that project with you and to bring that data asset together. And obviously there's lots of exciting opportunities with the MLO moving forward. So we are very grateful to be involved in that as well. So today, very quickly, I'm just very mindful I've got 10 minutes, probably less now, just a bit of a teaser and introduce a bit of the work so that can open up for questions and for the discussion that will follow. So I just want to talk to you, Alan, you asked us to talk about, what are our statistical priorities, and two key priorities that we've had more recently. Of course, data integration and putting out policy relevant data is always a priority, but we've got two particular projects that we're proud of that I just want to give a plug for. The Migrant Settlement Outcomes Project, which we commenced in partnership with the Department of Home Affairs. Sanaya, the settlements team in your office, well, they're now under you, came to us and they were looking for a set of indicators, or they developed a set of indicators with some advice from us to be able to understand humanitarian settlement outcomes for reporting, to get a really strong evidence base. So we came up with this new product where we brought information from PLIDA together to be able to report on a set of indicators. And the indicators are up there. I don't have to go through all of them: housing, citizenship, education, but pretty much a set of indicators that pretty much were identified as critical for successful settlement. And we thought that why not publish this? Why not publish this fantastic set of data that we'll now do on an annual basis? And we'll report not only for humanitarians, but we'll put the data out for skilled and family visa types, because of course, point of comparison is always good, but it has much more broader policy application to be able to present on the 3 permanent visa types. So just a bit of a snippet. I'll come into the data shortly. So that's the Migrant Settlement Outcomes work that we now publish yearly. So that's on our website. And the other exciting recent release for us as well, that I'll quickly talk about and present some data from, is data from the migrant data in LEAD, the Linked Employer-Employee database. And this is an internal collaboration we have with the Migrants Unit and Labour Force area in being able to bring migration data into LEAD. They already have publications on jobs in Australia and personal income in Australia that's produced about the general population labour outcomes, and published on the ABS website annually. And then a few years back, we thought, how about we bring migration data into that and be able to present data about migrants as well, specifically as part of that. So we've done that for the last 3 years, and we've recently published from there. So there's some things to be aware of and to have a look. Just some teaser bits of information from those projects that we've published. So, for instance, we're looking here at a graph that shows us the numbers or the proportions between looking at permanent migrants aged 15 to 64 years receiving personal income. We've looked at that by their visa stream, and also by the bars present, they categorise by arrival group. So we've looked at the migrants who have been here less than 5 years. This is the time from the time the 2022-23 tax data was relevant. Those migrants that have been here for less than 5 years, those who have been here between 5 and 10 years, and those who have been in the country for over 10 years. And we see some really interesting patterns. So you can see skilled migrants, a large proportion come and they start receiving personal taxable income. And that makes sense. That makes good sense. And you can see the levels in the arrival groups relatively stable. There's a bit of a dip, tiny dip in the over 10-year group. But you compare that to family and humanitarian, and you can see it's quite dramatic for humanitarian, that for those arrival groups, the longer they're here, it's quite dramatic increase in the number earning taxable income. And you can see that pattern in family as well, just not quite so dramatic. Just moving on to my next graph. This is all published in Migrant Settlement Outcomes, by the way. This is looking at one of the economic participation variables. So in this graph, we can see that we look at total median incomes, and the same pattern again. They increase the longer a permanent migrant has resided here. And one interesting fact about this data, it's total median income. So for the first time in our output, we've combined taxable income and income from government payments and benefits, because the reality is a lot of people their sources of income do include government payments as well as income earned. So we can look at the patterns once again by arrival groups, looking at the skilled, family, humanitarian visa streams. So we see a very similar pattern. This graph is presenting information from the Jobs in Australia publication that we released. Actually, this data was released last week. And this is delving a bit deeper. We're looking at the industry sectors of where migrants held jobs, and we're looking at that instead of arrival groups there. We've got the financial years, so we can go back to 2018-19 with this data set, and we've come through to 2022-23, which is the most recent tax data that we have. And this is really exciting to have this now presented because it takes us over those COVID years, and you can see some really interesting patterns in the data. So these are the top 5 industries of where migrants held jobs. And we can see the largest shares are in healthcare and social assistance, administrative and support services, accommodation and food services, and so on. So it's probably not surprising, but it is interesting that we've got a really solid evidence base now, and that means like future policy and changes over time can be picked up in this data because we've got a nice time series going on. And I think some of the patterns that we can see during COVID are really interesting. You can see the healthcare and social services. You can see the real jump between 2019-20 to 2020-21. And then with administrative and support services, you can see that it's moving in the opposite direction. And then with accommodation and food services, you've got the dip in the COVID years. So it's really interesting to see the patterns play out now. One thing to remember, so in this data set, I should have actually mentioned we include both permanent and temporary migrants. So which is a great thing because we've got both. And then I can just move on. This is just a bit of a teaser for just some of the information that we've got and the kind of things we can do. This is splitting up permanent and temporaries, and we're looking at the top industries in which migrant held jobs, the top 3. And so it's really interesting. Once again, we can see the patterns, and it breaks up in each of those industries, the share held by permanent and temporary migrants. So I think, Peter, you might be quite interested in this, and you can see the patterns are really clear. Now, we're not breaking up any further. It'd be really great then to go further and break the permanents up by whether they're a humanitarian, a skilled or a family. In the temporary, once again, we could break that up by whether they're temporary skilled or they're temporary students, but you can dig down. It would get too messy in this graph at the moment, but just very broadly, you can see that the largest share there for healthcare and social assistance is dominated by the permanent. Administrative and support services kind of a bit more balanced, and permanent and temporary, you can see temporaries take up the greater share of the accommodation and food services. So very interesting patterns in the data, and as I said, you can drill down a lot further. In this particular data set in the Jobs in Australia publication, if you go into our download, you can actually find the information for states as well, and there is a table builder as well. So I'm losing my voice because I had flu last week, so I'm starting to take its toll. Excuse me. So that fortunately does take us to the end. Very happy to take questions after I've had a drink of water. The other thing to point out here is the interesting patterns over the financial years as well. Once again, similar that I pointed out. But I better stop. I'm very happy to share slides. If anyone wants them, I've got a lot of links in here to other products that we have. So I'm very happy to chat to you further. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was really, really interesting. Okay, so now we have about 30 minutes for questions from the floor. We'll bring you a microphone, I think, is the plan, if you have a question. So if you could hold your hand up. Bernie, over here, thanks.
Thanks. think this is to Peter. You've had a long and storied history in working in this area. And it seems like everything is coming back full circle. I think you're saying that over lunch. So would you have any advice in terms of how we can change the narrative? And especially there was a question earlier on about how we can influence policy and make sure that we as statisticians and demographers are actually influencing the kind of disinformation space that's around and making sure that we're actually providing really good policy based discussion. Thanks.
I think it's going relatively well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
I have a question for probably more for Sneha, but for joining together your presentation with Peter's, which is, are temporary migrants encompassed within the scope of multicultural policy and how?
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Are temporary migrants encompassed within the scope of multicultural policy and its programs? And how? And if they're not, given the scale of them, is that a consideration that we need to bring into what's done?
It's you, I think.
Me first, yeah, and then you.
Um,
Thanks, Mark. To my kind of comments about working with states and territories, the way that we look at multicultural policy. So, for example, grants programs to grassroots community organisations. We're not saying to them what percentage of members of your organisation hold a permanent or temporary visa. It is the wider community. We sit within the immigration function because of the close linkages, but the way that we talk about the Australian community, regardless of the fact that people's visa pathways had a different impact on their experience of belonging and inclusion, means that we're looking right across the community and attitudes. So if someone has a negative attitude towards multiculturalism or towards migration or, you know, towards particular ethnic groups, they're not delineating between the permanent or temporary nature of that person's visa status. But I think that the wider conversation, obviously, about temporary and permanent migration is inextricably linked to what Australia looks like today, rather than what the statistics from Peter tell you.
One of the problems at the moment is that temporary migrants are, described in very disparaging terms very often. That I see the other day one of the commentators referring to them. Do we need another Uber driver? And that's part of the multicultural thing. I think that what I'm trying to provide here is some kind of recognition, that they are in fact very important in Australian society, and even the Uber driver. We are definitely a convenience society now. We expect everything to be delivered to us, our food, our packages and parcels, and we expect to be delivered where we want to go. And a lot of that is done by temporary migrants. And so they might not be in skilled jobs, like I was saying, but they're still in important jobs. And most of the workers in aged care are not skilled workers either, but they are providing a very, very important function. And it's really problematic, I think, when you see an aged care worker has a certificate to do aged care, is working in a residence for a period of time, has developed a good relationship with the with the people residing in the aged care place, and then their visa expires. They've got to leave, and the manager has got to find another person to replace them. It's a very, very inefficient system. And that's not just in aged care. I've heard it said about the construction sector as well, that people working in construction, good workers, sorry, visas ended. The employer's got to find another worker, you know. So I don't really know what the solution is. The only solution I've got is with respect to the partners of Australian citizens, they should be given permanent, you know, there should be a limit of 12 months processing time on their visas. It's completely pointless not to give them permanent residence. Most of them are already living in Australia. And when you contrast them with the partners of new skilled migrants, it's completely, there's this huge discrimination, you know, against the Australian citizen. The fees are vastly higher for the partner of an Australian citizen compared to the partner of a new skilled person. The new skilled person gets in immediately without the kind of scrutiny that goes into the partner of the Australian citizen. It's just completely pointless to not give them permanent residence. But if you are giving them permanent residence, the implication is that the permanent residence number is going to go up. And that's a political problem. But it's only a political problem. It's not a problem in any other way. And so, you know, we need to be biting the bullet and saying, you know, increasing permanent residence for that group is highly desirable.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
Thank you all. Your comments, Peter, just made me think that I've often wondered if migrants went on strike for a day, what would happen? You know, we'd really feel the impact of their the effort that they bring. And I say that as a child of migrants and someone married to a migrant. But my question is about retention, because a lot of this morning's conversation focused on the productivity narrative, which I think is very narrow. And your comments just now talk about retention, which at a community level is critical, because you said the efficiencies of constantly training, but also in local communities, people want people to stay. They don't want that churn of people through. So how can we also bring retention into this conversation? Sorry, that's a broad question, but yeah.
I think it's for somebody else to solve, actually. There is a huge problem. And as I say, it's going to get worse and worse. And there's very little attention given to it because we're all off talking about mass migration and so it does require a little bit of bravery, I think, on the part of government to take the actions that are required. Yeah.
Sorry. Jenny, did you have any comments that you'd like to add to that?
Probably can't comment about retention. That's probably more of a policy comment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Down the front here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Were very interesting. I work in the PAM scheme in the Department of Employment, and I'm also an affiliate of the Center of European Studies here at the university. And I was very interested, but Jenny will be knocking at your door very often with requesting data. But I was interested. My question regards the multicultural office. And I was wondering if sometimes we could avoid it because multiculturalism can become a political thing as well, even though it's cultural.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and so in order to avoid the pitfalls or the problems that we have, the multiculturalism has had in Europe and Canada and other places, have you considered as well some sort of intercultural exchange, some valuing of the Australian culture as well that was here that has made Australia become what it is today? in terms especially of political culture, and maybe emphasizing the political culture of Australia in terms of democracy, human rights, and so on. That would be a way to assuage some of the fears that people may have, especially when the media radicalizes or, multiculturalism.
Thank you. So I guess a couple of things. So I say social cohesion and multiculturalism are different things. So kind of you'll see issues between communities, or the domestic impacts of geopolitical events kind of playing out. But fundamentally, the human connection between communities is what brings them together, and we see that in schools. We see that in communities. I see Simon Chan's here from Multicultural New South Wales, so there is that kind of connection at the local level. I think that what we do see is that when things play out online, in kind of that online environment, unchecked, that has a really negative impact. But fundamentally, through our kind of our network, particularly of community liaison officers, but also in our state offices, is that you bring people together with a look at a kind of an intersectional lens. So it might be whether it's women or young people or kind of a range of other kind of diversities, is that it's the commonality that brings people together rather than their fundamental differences. And so the more you talk about kind of inclusion and belonging rather than about, you're multicultural, or you're a woman, or you're a young person, or you have a disability, or perhaps all of those things, then the more connection you have. Yeah.
Thank you. Yep. Come to you next.
Hi, and thank you very much, everyone, for the presentations. The question is for Sneha about Australia being the most successful multicultural country. I'm not disagreeing, but I'm interested what metrics you measured success by. Thank you.
So I said it at the start somewhat facetiously, because any community event that you go to where a politician is speaking, it's the first line of their talking points. So I think it's good to kind of get that out early. So like I said, somewhat facetiously, it's the kind of the way we talk about it is around the percentage of Australians born overseas who have at least one parent born overseas, and the kind of generational impact of those many decades of migration, 80 years of the Immigration Department, and of course, many, many years before then. But also fundamentally, we are pretty unique in terms of our like countries that, that we compare ourselves to, in the way that people come together in communities, and also the way that our society kind of reflects who we are. So I think it's around, kind of generations of managed migration programs, and also the way we are structured as a community. But I can come back to you on the exact metrics that have underpinned that bold statement for years as well.
Thanks. I'm just going to take this gentleman. Yeah, put your hand up. Thanks.
Peter, I love the word that was...
Speak up.
I love the word that you put in there, in bold, the crunch that's coming. And it's quite interesting because people think it's bad at the moment, but I don't think many people are seeing what we've got coming up. And as a demographer, you would know, I've had the lived experience as a migrant. I've helped thousands of people migrate to the country as well, across most industries and most locations and so on. At this point in time, statistically, the outgoing cohort of the Australian workforce is far greater than the incoming Australian.
I've got bad hearing.
Sorry, the outgoing cohort of the Australian workforce is far greater than the incoming Australian workforce. We've got as many going out of the workforce as we have going in. We've also got a pending issue with, we're a lucky country. We've got, the largest intergenerational wealth transfer that's coming through. We've already got rich Australians in many occupations, like electricians, that have been working, being paid highly, had their own property, millionaires. And the intergenerational wealth transfer is anywhere between 2.5 to 5.4 trillion dollars that's going to be passed down to the current workforce and future workforce. So we're going to have even more rich Australians that don't necessarily need to work, they choose to work. And using the example of the electrician, if that electrician then has $2 million that's put down on them, they're already wealthy, are they going to work as electricians? And then when we look at construction, you can't just click your fingers and get an electrician. They take 6 years. And I've been doing a construction roadshow, and we've had the CEO of the National Electrical Communications Association, who said, well, if the Jobs and Skills Council say we're short 42,000, that means with attrition, we need to put 70,000 into the pipeline by January 2026. So he said, we failed already. And what we're going to do over the next 12 to 24 months is how much we fail by. And so I just wanted you to sort of elaborate on the crunch, and maybe there was probably another word you wanted to put in there that you might.
Yeah, well, that's kind of all about labour force planning, and we have a Jobs and Skills Australia, and tells us where the shortages are, but the industry people also tell us where the shortages are, and there are lots of shortages. And it's really not part of the debate, but I guess in the obvious one that, we can't construct houses if we don't have any workers, that one's getting a bit of coverage. But it goes right across the economy where there are labour shortages, and that holds up investment, that if new investment doesn't take place because the workers are not there. The one good change, I think, was that when the coalition was in power, the temporary skilled visa, the numbers on the temporary skilled visa went downwards. And I don't quite understand that, except that following an inquiry, which I was part of, unfortunately, the coalition government put this huge tax on having a temporary skilled worker, $5,000 a year per worker. And that could have led to that drop. But now the temporary skilled worker is rising quite substantially, and that's partly because employers can't get skilled migrants, so go to the temporary. The temporary migrants are going to build up. Employers are actually going to want to make them permanent in the future, but they won't be able to because the numbers are not there in the program. Employers are going to be very, very frustrated by that. They're used to a 98% success rate for employer-sponsored, but it's already dropping, already huge delays. Like I say, there's a crunch coming, but nobody's taking much notice of it, because we're all off on mass migration,
Okay, great. Anyone over this side missing out one?
Thank you. Question for you, Jenny. Has the ABS done any analysis on the outcomes of migrants employed in the gig economy?
Oh, apologies. Can you repeat that question?
Has the ABS done any analysis on the outcomes of migrants employed in the gig economy?
In the gig economy. That's they may have from the labour force perspective. We haven't explored that into, and I know it's like in terms of specific migrant jobs, although it is an area that we do need to investigate, I believe, and understanding the outcomes and their earnings. So no, probably an area there is a great potential for us to explore. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, team? Yep.
Hello, I'm Susan Love. I'm from the Parliamentary Library. Question for Sneha, if I can. You talked a bit about the purpose and what the Office of Multicultural Affairs does now. I would just like to expand on that a little bit. Can you sort of talk a bit about how that sort of differs from just having it as a section or a branch within the department, and a bit about, I think you said that Mike Cully had pointed out that back in the day there was a Office of Multicultural Affairs as a different structure. I think it was rather independent of the department. So what does it mean to have this new entity sitting within the Department of Home Affairs, and also perhaps within the Department of Home Affairs rather than in another agency, since Multicultural Affairs has also been, for example, in social services previously? Just maybe talk a little bit about the place of Multicultural Affairs within its portfolio, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. So I think the key difference is an independent, kind of a standalone minister for Multicultural Affairs, a cabinet minister. It's the first time that there's been a cabinet minister, and part of Minister Ali's responsibilities sit right across the Commonwealth, but a lot of the levers sit within the office. I think when it was first established, and I'm sure Professor Shergold can correct me, in the late 70s was in PM&C as a pure policy function. We have a whole range of programs, administered funding that we look after, that is not just about settlement funding or English language funding, etc., but also around grants that increase community, like kind of capacity building programs, which means that if you combine the policy, the program, and the engagement with the networks of engagement teams, you have a much better connection to the impact of those programs. Like I said, I would say it's really early days, and Minister Ali certainly has some really kind of big ideas around reimagining multiculturalism, particularly in terms of economic participation. So if there's anyone, kind of from other agencies here, it's certainly something that we kind of support her on. But it's closely linked with the immigration function, because, the impacts of the humanitarian program, for example, have a direct impact on settlement. If you pull it apart, it gets really hard to deliver some of those big programs. But in terms of kind of statutory kind of arrangements and all that, I couldn't comment.
Thank you. We have.
Hi, thank you all for the presentation. I think that just speaking from a more connected perspective of the outcomes of migrants, I was thinking that, because we all know that temporary migrants are sort of at a more disadvantaged, position than permanent migrants. And I was thinking that perhaps one of the reasons is that when it comes to the outcomes of temporary migrants is that there is a large sort of skills mismatch of the temporary migrants. And I was wondering if, the ABS will have to have a look when it comes to data collections and analysis part. We consider that in the future, report on data collections. And also this, when I thinking about like skills mismatch, that also brings me to the second part of my question, is that for the multicultural part, I mean, it can be an objective concept, but it also has some subjective perspective in it. For example, you were talking about the sense of belonging, assimilations of the immigration. So I was thinking that if perhaps we can, for the data collection purpose, we can have this subjective things, when it combine it with the outcomes, not just looking at objective outcomes like income, employment status, but also social cohesion, how does temporary migrants actually feel about my life, about my job, and how would it actually, just as a part of the outcomes of migrants. Thank you.
I was just nodding along and then didn't put my mic on to respond to your question. Absolutely. I think it's the combination, right? And so when we say it's kind of evidence-based policy, it's both, the insights from reports like the Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion report, for example, which is around how people feel and how they report they feel. And then also the important work that Jenny and her team do around the collection of the, economic participation statistics and various other economic
exactly
metrics.
right. Yeah, I think it is the way, it is certainly a holistic view, and it's an important one. And I do think those reports like the mapping social cohesion do help, because they're looking at some of the characteristics that about the individual. For instance, it might be their visa type, characteristics of employment, education, trying to get at that, trying to understand, do their qualifications, are they commensurate with, how they're earning an income, and then seeing what the outcomes are to the more subjective type questions. That is how you get at that kind of research. So it is important, and I know it is being looked at, but certainly that's the beauty of us coming together and putting our perspectives together to kind of investigate those kind of outcomes that are important.
We're coming towards the end of our time. So I'm going to take a few more questions. Alan, I'll give you chair's privilege and then I'll come to you.
Thanks so much. This is a question building on the one from our colleague from the Parliamentary Library. It seems two of the most exciting things going on at the moment are the creation of this new Office of Multicultural Affairs. I'm speaking from the perspective, I guess, of someone who watches the Department of Home Affairs closely when I say some of the most
Keen observer,
things.
I think we call you that, keen observer.
Yeah. So the creation of the Office of Multicultural Affairs and the creation of Christian's new unit, the analytics, data and analytics section. And I was just remarking with somebody in one of the breaks that the people who sort of gravitate towards these two fields tend to come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. We have quantitative demographers and economists who tend to gravitate towards the data and analytics, and then we have anthropologists and sociologists who tend to go towards the study of the settlement journey of migrants. And I just wondered what's going on. What are the discussions in the department? Hopefully, we're in a candid enough environment to speak to this. What are the discussions going on in the department, in the wider community about how are you going to bridge that gap between those two different sets of disciplinary perspectives on looking at migration questions? Because it seems like, as you said, Sneha, that having those two together is actually a critical part of managing migration well.
Thanks, Alan. So verbal Christian is what is potentially his third week in Home Affairs, maybe fourth, end of third, yeah. But when we're doing policy work, so we've had a policy lab recently, and we absolutely had people from Christian's team in that policy lab, because you can't just have one conversation without the other, without reflecting on the insights from the demographers and the economists and the statisticians to provide, I guess, an evidence base, combined with, program evaluations, policy impact, all those sorts of kind of core public service activities, without that connection. So early days for Christian team, but I did make a point of introducing myself to him very early on, maybe in his first hour in the organisation, just to make sure that we were really connected and that our policy work is not happening in isolation.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a question for Professor McDonald. I wanted to.
You'll just have to speak up a bit.
I wanted to just ask, inquire a little further into that finding in your presentation about the 35% earnings gap of temporary visa holders in certain firms and certain sectors, if I understood correctly?
I'm not getting it, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'll move a bit closer.
Oh, no, 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 that's fine. I'll just shout.
Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to inquire further, Professor McDonald, into that finding of the 35% earnings gap that you had raised in your presentation, temporary visa holders in certain firms and certain sectors. And just curious to understand more the economics behind that as an answer to some of the people who are concerned about migration into Australia. So what would happen if the counterfactual was true, if there were no migrants in those sectors? Is the assumption that the wages would then be higher and they would then be able to attract non-migrants? Is that sort of an assumption that would be correct in your view, or what?
Well, it was
if you can
one,
answer to this.
particularly in the trades, it was an assumption that we don't want workers to come in from overseas to work in the trades because we want wages to be higher for Australian tradesmen. But the fallacy of that was that if you don't have the workers at all, the project's not going to take place. And so, you can't talk really about the differential in wages. So don't bring a boilermaker into Australia. If you don't bring a boilermaker into Australia, Australian boilermakers will all be paid $300,000 a year. No, that's not going to happen. But it's just that the project doesn't happen. So there has to be a balance, in other words, between the domestic workers and migrants and part of the investment. The investment doesn't happen if the workers are going to cost way too much money.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Peter. Maybe one last question up the back.
You want to hear this one either?
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. It might be that there's a bit of a paucity of data around this, but I was wondering if any of you have any insight into the employment and economic outcomes for people seeking asylum on long-term bridging visas or temporary protection visas as opposed to those who have permanent protection?
Yeah, probably we find them in the humanitarian data, although I'd have to understand it might be in the some of the categories under the humanitarian, because we can split the data by refugees. So we probably can inform on some of that and look at some pathways into the country. And I don't know how finely we can break that down, but we could certainly investigate some of those outcomes.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any last burning questions that I have to get out this afternoon? If you do, please put your hand up. Okay, just one here. We'll just bring the mic over to you.
Thank you. Building on what Alan's mentioned about the gap, as someone who had ethnographic research background, I do want to highlight that, in fact, migrants, myself included in the past, there are structural constraints that prevent us from immediately accessing the labor market. For example, when I arrived in Australia, I had a young child and then I soon had another child. And as temporary migrant, I did not have access to childcare subsidies, for example, and that prevented me from actively seeking employment for several years. Now I'm back in labor force, but it does contradict with the whole idea of promoting migration as a driving force of productivity and economic growth. Because in current climate, with the rising cost of living and housing prices, it's really important, really hard to establish yourself first with single householding, one single income. And I think this lived experience does matter and should be reflected in policy making. And as a result, lots of migrants fall into informal economy, which official data fail to capture fully. And I just wanted to highlight those points.
Yes, a very important point. Any comments, team, that you'd like to add into that?
I can only try and, I guess, answer from the data perspective side of things. We do try and understand, certainly when we're thinking about data gaps, it's those barriers to the labour market that we try and understand. Look at the people who aren't in the labour force, trying to understand what is it they're doing? Are they studying? Have they got children? You can only go so far down in the data, and that is a limitation of administrative data. Administrative data is amazing as long as they engage, with certain agencies, or if they're earning an income, or they're on Medicare, or they're in social services data, we can capture them. But there's things that just don't get captured in the admin data, and a lot of it's about those barriers and some of those challenges that new migrants face. So I do think that that's where survey data can help with understanding those subjective experiences better, so that policy can be built around that. But it is a data challenge. So I just want to acknowledge that it is something that we're mindful of, the gaps, and understanding barriers has always been kind of a key data area to understand.
If all the services that Australian citizens are able to get access to were extended to temporary migrants, it would cost an absolute fortune. And so the governments are not going to do it, right? For that reason. But I think we have to kind of recognise that we are exploiting them. That, we're actually not the fair go society where everybody is equal and everybody gets a fair go. We're not providing these services to workers who are paying the same taxes and everything else. It's not going to happen, but I think that there needs to be more of a recognition of who we really are.
Thank you so much, Peter. Well, on that note, I'm going to draw this session to a close. I think it's been both very rich and very revealing. You now have afternoon tea, so that's some good news, and an opportunity to do some networking. And then at 2:45, a really important session, Migration, Mobility and the Asia Pacific Neighbourhood, on our back doorstep, of course. So thank you all very much for attending. And can you thank our panel? Thanks so much.